Hey, Vanessa. Seems like the Christmas spirit is still with you. The preemptive Christmas spirit.
Adam interrupted my flow. I was literally sitting in my room singing to myself the 12 days of Christmas.
How far did you get?
I was into 7 swans of swimming.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Well, you took a while to get set up.
Podcasting is a harrowing job, Vanessa.
Yeah.
Our guest today is Chloe Valdary, who I've been wanting to talk to for a while. But before bringing her in, I gotta say, I'm angry, Vanessa.
Oh.
It's been one of those weeks. We have the latest slew of frivolous anti-American Republic lawsuits coming from the Trump campaign. We have Rush Limbaugh calling for secession. And literally today we had some political violence in Washington over what seems to be nothing but the abstract idea of political divide. It made me think of the conversation we had with David French and about his book, Divided We Fall. It's his Cassandra vision about secession in the U.S. I recommend people go back listen to the conversation and afterwards go and get the book. Specifically, read the chapter about the Texit scenario, the Texas secession, which is insanely being discussed with more and more earnest, serious tones on the right. And I'm not a global secession expert, but it seems to me that if this is going to happen, this will be one of the stupidest pretexts for an independence movement in history. This will be a political revolution driven almost entirely and exclusively by a parasitic, opportunistic, self-serving media industrial complex. And it's freaking depressing. So in that regard, I guess this is a good week to talk to Chloe Valdary. And just before getting there, I should send... Oh, by the way, you're listening to Uncertain Things. Thank you. I will never remember. Thank you, dear listener, for listening to Uncertain Things. Hi, Vanessa.
Hi, Adam.
Where was I? Lamenting the phantasmagoria of political media.
Or you can ignore everything that's going on in the world and sing Christmas carols to yourself.
Well, we're going to do neither. And turn to our guest.
No, Adam. I choose art. You see, this is the segue. I choose art, as does Chloe Valdary. See? What do you think?
Well done, Vanessa. The difference is that unlike our previous artist guests, Adam Neely and Ken Goshen, Chloe Valdary uses art to help us think through our political moment and our social distress. Her startup, the Theory of Enchantment, is offering an alternative education module for companies and groups to try to bridge political tensions and the racial tensions in a method that is an alternative to the common anti-racist theory. She actually positions herself as the antagonist of critical race theory and its derivatives. And to do that, she relies on our cultural canon, which spans from Plato and Aristotle to Jay-Z. And instead of over-focusing on grievances, which has become a bipartisan currency in our current culture, she tries to help people find solace and strength in their history.
Yeah, I mean, I think for her, the whole point of art in whatever form it takes is that it allows us to experience and understand the human condition. And I think for her, that's kind of what's lacking in our discourse, like a lack of understanding of our humanity and what it means to be human, no matter which political spectrum we are or wherever we are in terms of background, ideology, race, whatever. But I think that's kind of really key to understanding her work and the way that she comports herself, I think, in terms of the conversation, whether it be on Twitter or elsewhere.
And if you don't know Chloe Valdary, you should find her first and foremost on Twitter, where she is just doing God's work, really. She's battling the insanity from the right. She's combating the derangements from the left. She is saying, fuck all y'all. And here's...
Except she's not doing it in such a combative way. She's not
as pugilistic. Quite the contrary, actually. She's a reconciliator. She tries to find a way for us to actually be able to talk to each other. But the thing is that she calls out people for intentionally eliding the nuance in conversations, and she brings it back.
And you'll notice that we haven't actually used a term to describe her. It's not like we could say like historian or philosopher. Chloe Valdary.
She's the DJ of the political conversational intellectual space.
Exactly. I was going to say that she's kind of she's a DJ. She's a curator, if you will. And it's kind of hard to pin her down, which is awesome. And she delights in that. She delights in being a bit of a paradoxical figure.
Yeah, go follow her at cvaldary on Twitter, and go follow us at UncertainPod on Twitter, Instagram, the lot. And also make sure that you follow and subscribe us on uncertain.substack.com or wherever you catch your podcast. Please give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts if you're feeling generous. And with that, we bring you Chloe Valdary. Hey, Chloe. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, thank you for inviting me.
We're, as we said in the pre-recording, we're really excited to have you, and you're one of those people that there's just so much that I've been wanting to talk to you about, so that it's going to be dense. Hopefully we'll get through some of it, but so first I just wanted to tell you why I was really excited about having you, and why I love your work. And I think there's a certain type of people who get turned on by contradictions, who are moved by the human capacity to hold more than one truth, irreconcilable truth at the same time, and who love those tensions. Your debut as a DJ, your debut album as a DJ is called Paradox. I used to go back when I was writing for outlets, my tagline used to say it's something like enamored with cognitive dissonance. So that's so can you tell me a little bit about that, and if you agree with this description?
Yes, I was basically born and raised in a state of cognitive dissonance. That's not quite true. I would say maybe paradox is a better term to describe how I was raised, but because of my religious upbringing, I grew up in a Christian family that was both critical of mainstream Christianity and but simultaneously considered its own manifestation of Christianity the true Christianity, and also believed that the correct way to be a Christian was to partake in the observance of things like Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and Jewish holidays. And what this created was a paradoxical relationship with both Christianity and Judaism. From the Christian perspective, it was an insider-outsider relationship because I grew up in an environment that was, again, critical of the mainstream, but also very much proudly Christian. And its relationship with Judaism was, I'd say, outside of Judaism, but also simultaneously deferential to it. And also, like, because of the observance of these holidays, I had an identity that streamed out of Judaism while simultaneously not being Jewish. And so that created an identity, or a complex multivariate identity, which meant that checked boxes weren't as capable of really successfully or precisely depicting or conveying what it was what community I belonged to. So in that sense, I was introduced and raised in paradox, and especially because religion was a very important aspect of my family's life for a very long time. And so it was taken seriously. The other thing I'd say about that is there's a very somewhat inquisitive tradition. Growing up, we didn't celebrate festivals, mainstream Christian festivals like Christmas and Halloween and Easter. And instead what we did was we, on the days thereof, we basically sat in the living room and read historical texts about the history of these festivals and how they came to be. So that also gave me a cosmopolitan awareness, or an awareness of history, and awareness of the past that continues to this day to have a very, very strong effect on how I see the world, how I view the world, how I approach the world.
Can you give me an example of how it comes to bear on your current work and how you view the world?
Yeah, for example, I think that a lot of our contemporary conversations that have both cultural and political implications in America right now with regard to power and seeing power in what I think is a very narrow lens, reflects a very basic ignorance of like previous civilizations that have come before us, and just an awareness of, I won't say how far we've come, quote unquote, because while I agree that we've come so far, I'm increasingly against what I suspect is like this cult of progress that has affected the West in many ways. So I don't mean to suggest that I think that we're like going towards some utopian point, because I don't really believe in that. And I don't think that's the purpose of life. But I do think that there's an ignorance amongst many elites who comment on power in our discourse about, with just regard to like the different ways in which we're able to actually accrue power in ways that are not zero sum. When previously in a pre-democratic world, they're far more zero sum, and the options that regular individuals had, the peasants, if you will, were far more limited in scope than they are today. And I do consider myself to be a peasant, just to clarify.
Yeah, we are all plebes.
Yes.
I mean, one of the things that always strikes me when you bring up history, not just you, when history comes up, and like the term of the Enlightenment comes a lot recently, sure, very frequently, and the shallowness in which it's being discussed is like it has, sure, to be either original sin or the source of all our current moral plights, or it is, you need to champion it as this is the recipe for human salvation.
Yeah.
And the aside for both options being boring, they're also so useless. And I think, and that's why I think that there's a type there, because there is a type that really needs to look back at history only to find heroes and villains. And there is a different way of looking at the world, which is that double vision looking of the world and recognizing that this good and evil are just a matter of the angle in which the idea, sure, catches the light, and, sure, and enjoy that. Also take pleasure in that contradiction. And the way that you engage yourself publicly always tries to push the conversation further in that direction, like away from the simplicity and the dichotomy of good and evil, into the not only see the complexity, but also enjoy it. Enjoy the fact that relish in it.
Yes, I think that this is, although I've always been drawn to paradox, I didn't necessarily have a easy relationship with paradox. I didn't always, I guess you'd say, you so easily have this sensibility of relishing in it, and that took some time. And I think that that's okay. It's okay to become to understand that like there's a maturation process, I think, that has to happen in order to be, I mean, in the literal sense of the word, enlightened. It's a new kind of enlightenment, to be able to hold space for different ideas that are competing in nature. And I'm still learning, still refining. I don't necessarily, I don't find it easy to hold space for those things in every single context, in every single subject that I, run across. But the idea itself, the concept itself of training oneself to be able to do that is something that I find very attractive. And I also prefer the language of refinement to the language of perfection, or like, again, this cult of progress that I've been thinking about lately that has, I think, negatively affecting the West. And I think that that's contained in these conversations about the Enlightenment, right? So like, I think, I would say the Enlightenment contained both good and bad. And to be able to come to a point where you're not like, your identity is not threatened by that. And actually, like to have the idea that maybe that is the beautiful legacy, or
Right,
can be the
exactly.
beautiful legacy of the West, is that not exclusively the domain of the West, but still in its own way and in its own form, the capacity to hold both. I mean, that is the true promise, I think, or one of the true promises of Western civilization.
I really didn't intend to get into that, but you keep bringing up the cult of progress, which which is funny because we in our house, Vanessa and I are roommates, and in our little household, we've been having this conversation quite a lot recently.
Okay.
And that it's really interesting that the issue of progress, because I've been definitely finding myself very comfortably criticizing both the contemporary right and left in my political work, but I recently realized that I still had this very profound bias of progress, almost a religious belief in progress, and which is not necessarily what would be assumed as progress by American progressives, but just the idea that over time things get better, which is a total theological assumption. Like there's nothing there to justify it, that tomorrow won't be much worse, or that, say, technological improvement only goes in one direction. It's interesting because it is an article of faith.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm very much moved by the work of Carl Jung and his writings on the numinous and his analysis of certain theological traditions, certainly Christianity, and his interpretations of Christianity, which are fascinating. But yeah, I mean, Max Weber wrote this great essay called Disenchantment back in the day, where he critiqued he saw the ends of, or the dangers of, the Protestant work ethic when taken to extremes. And he remarked that Protestant work ethic could end up creating not a city on the hill, which is what the original Protestants wanted to create when they, escaped persecution in Europe, but fortresses of finance, and for their own sake, right? Just for the purposes of existing. And I only know this because when I was promoting Theory of Enchantment, my company back in the day, so I saw a comment and that asked me if it had anything to do with Max Weber and his Disenchantment. And I hadn't read that. And then I read it and I was like, well, this is interesting just from the perspective of thinking through some of the crises I think we have today, certainly in America, with regard to like alienation and atomization, and which is a huge deal. And it, I think, is driven in part by that cult of progress, and that a lot of us don't even know that we are imprisoned within. So
it seems too like there's when I think about the phrase "a fortress of finance," I think about a lack of engagement with art and culture. There's something about that phrase that makes me think of all of us worker bees, like going towards some sort of monetary advancement. And that's the only, and I do find that when I look at American culture, that is one of the defining characteristics, is how driven we are by work and money. And I think about how people don't take vacation and but not only that, but they don't necessarily engage with art and culture in a way that other cultures seem to more readily. And I'm curious if you, first of all, I think some people who are listening may not be familiar with Theory of Enchantment. So if you wouldn't mind describing it a little bit and the ways that it does engage with art and culture.
Yeah, absolutely. So I started Theory of Enchantment really as a way to bring social emotional learning to high school students a couple years ago. And it's a full learning, it's a full training program, rather, 25 lessons that teaches people how to develop a healthy sense of self, develop a sense of wholeness, healthy relationship with themselves, so that they can then develop healthy relationships with others. And it uses art as a platform to help people experience this process of self-refinement, but specifically it uses pop culture to teach a lot of the modules. So, for example, Theory of Enchantment is built upon three principles. The first principle is treat people like human beings, not political abstractions. Second principle is criticize to uplift and empower, never to tear down or destroy. And the third principle is try to root everything you do in love and compassion. And we teach aspects of the first principle by introducing individuals to something that may feel or sound cliche, but which is really the process of understanding what the human condition actually is, what it actually means to be a human being, going through some of the things that connects us universally as human beings. So things that we all encounter, for example, like imperfection, how to deal with mortality, how to deal with parental baggage, emotional regulation. And we use both past and contemporary pop culture to teach some of these things. So, for example, in our emotional regulation training, we actually introduce people to Stoicism and to the teachings of Marcus Aurelius. But we do so in a way by bringing it into the contemporary present, by having the principles of Stoicism, or teaching people how the principles of Stoicism are also reflected in Disney's The Lion King. So by having the like Disney films and also contemporary music and study of certain artists within hip hop, be in conversation with the past, with wisdom of the past, wisdom that has been articulated by folks like James Baldwin and Dr. King and Maya Angelou, all of whom are have been curated really in this training. What we seek to do is help transform people's experience of the past and the present and of themselves and where they're situated within that. So it started out as a social emotional learning training for students, but it's morphed into a training to help businesses develop best practices for anti-racism strategies, and to develop diversity and inclusion within the workplace. And the reason for that is Theory of Enchantment is a startup, and I've learned one of the not hardest, but I guess challenging things to learn that I've learned in building a startup is that it's not only okay to pivot, it's probably best that you learn how to pivot.
Right.
And if you didn't pivot, probably you're running yourself down.
Yeah, basically. Basically. And also I had to learn that to depersonalize, I had to learn how to see things not as mistakes with which you will be punitively, treated for making those mistakes, but it's just like lessons, And I feel like a lot of people say this, but it when it clicks, it clicks. So I pivoted, and the reason why I pivoted was because with everything that happened this year with regard to George Floyd and Black Lives Matter protests, all of these companies were coming out of the woodworks saying they're going to allocate budgets toward diversity and inclusion training. And there's a particular mode of training out there that falls under the umbrella of what's known as critical race theory that is, quite frankly, wreaking havoc both in the public school system and in the workplaces. I've had multiple clients and prospective clients tell me that, their employees are feeling like they can't speak out against it. They can't criticize it. There's very chilling effects. They're feeling a lack of trust between themselves and their colleagues. And so many people in my wheelhouse reached out, and people organically, for a whole host of reasons, found Theory of Enchantment. And so I've decided to position it as the alternative, better training when it comes to teaching people how to build an organic, sustainable model or culture within the workplace that would be welcoming and model the principles of diversity and inclusion in a real way, not in a, I think, shallow way.
Okay, this is pretty fascinating. Yeah.
And there's a lot there, and also you're such a good guest. You basically handled the segue for us.
Totally. But yes. Adam, can I? Do you want to take a second to go back though? Is that okay?
Yeah, actually, I also want to.
Yeah. So
we're so anti-progress. We're just.
I'm wondering because I definitely want to unpack a lot of what you've been talking about, but I do want. Would you mind taking us back? Yeah. What was the summer like for you, both personally, and then obviously you've already hinted to kind of professionally, but would you mind kind of explaining what this year was like? So
I would say, first of all, as soon as COVID-19 hit, I had the strangest feeling that things were going to start to percolate with enchantment. I just had this, because it's really set up to help people deal with cognitive dissonance, really, and to make sense of, and COVID-19 was really a moment on a global level where people on a massive scale went from, oh, I know exactly what the world is about and how the world works, to I have no idea. That's chaos, right? And so to be able to help people navigate through chaos is what theory of enchantment was essentially set up to do. Now, when the protests started happening, what was interesting was my apartment actually essentially became a meeting place because my roommate, Zach, decided that as someone who had read the sermons by Dr. King and loved Dr. King and loved the writings of James Baldwin, for example, he wanted to go out and really try to practice some of the nonviolent ideas that these men preached. And so our apartment ended up becoming a meeting ground, essentially, for certain people who were part of the protest. He essentially became an organizer. Now, it's important to clarify something for those in your audience who may not know. Like, the protests, there was no and is no coherence in the protests. Like, groups from all over representing all kinds of different things showed up to the protests, and this affected, I guess you could say, the ability for people to cooperate between groups, so cooperation between groups, but also cooperation within groups. One of the biggest challenges that I saw Zach go through was really like people not being able to agree on what the mission was. They were able to agree that police brutality was wrong. Right. So they were able to articulate what they were against, but they were not able to articulate what they were for. And just by sitting in on these meetings, which were, as you can imagine, very heated and very long, went all the way until like 3 a.m. This was happening for like 3 months in my apartment. So it was fascinating from a human psychology perspective to see. So in that sense, I was sort of, again, that insider-outsider relationship. I was inside it and outside it all at the same time. I had these moments where I thought to myself, is there a way, could there be a way to try to inject theory of enchantment training into like the movement, essentially? But I went to one of the protests and I couldn't really see a way to do that. It was just very, very chaotic. And I just came away with a conclusion that I needed to, that how I could serve that was actually by just continuing to expand theory of enchantment in the way that it was expanding. So that, I think, is what I would say I was experiencing from a personal perspective. And then from a professional perspective, at some point, I guess the stars just aligned and a client reached out and said to me, I've seen other firms and the programs that they've offered, and I haven't seen anything like this, like what you're offering. Mm-hmm. And I hesitated for the longest time to pivot in the way that I described to you earlier, because that pivot was oppositional. And I'm not necessarily, although I'm leaning into that spirit, but I'm not necessarily an oppositional girl. I'm a very like chill person. But I've learned the beauty of that. And I think that speaks to what we talked about earlier, which is like the ability to hold space it's related to that ability to hold space for multiple things, but also to play in that space simultaneously is cool.
What is it that you see it becoming oppositional to?
It's oppositional to critical race theory.
Right. And what it is in critical race theory that you are creating an alternative for? And what do you diagnose as the problem there?
So the problem, I'd say, is ultimately twofold. Number one, critical race theorists believe that the singular thing of the most important significance in human affairs is race, that it's predeterminant, ironically, in a way. So that's one piece that I would say is problematic. But the more critical piece is that
you said ironic because in being defiant of the Enlightenment or the European tradition of racism, it absorbed that fiction as fundamental to human existence. Exactly.
It's like it's still imprisoned in the delusion.
Yep.
But more critically, it operates according to a fundamental misunderstanding of the human being, which is not moved simply by materialism. Because what critical race theory calls for really is a an exchange of material goods and power in order to rectify racism. And this has been articulated in some of the more prominent books that are out today, like How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi, for example. And I always like to, we come at it from a psychological perspective. You know, the human being has very basic needs, including, of course, food, water, shelter, which are all material. But in fact, these are not the things that alone contribute to the flourishing of human society. A human being also needs to have a feeling of significance, belonging, love, both for themselves and for others, feeling of wholeness. And if that piece is missing, then you're actually more likely to fall into the trap of seeing the world through a racial lens. Because what happens is, if you don't have a feeling of significance or belonging, you are likely to overcompensate for that. And that might lead to gravitation toward supremacist movements. This is the basic psychology of, young white men in particular who gravitate toward white nationalist movements. And it doesn't always manifest in racial ways. It can be, a guy whose father is no longer in the picture, feels a sense of abandonment, gravitates toward a gang because the gang promises him that community. But it's not, it is the psychology in the simplest way of speaking about it, of how extremism works. And it seems to me that the proponents of critical race theory know none of this about the human condition. It's completely absent from the theory itself, and they end up creating the conditions that increase that scarcity and increase that insecurity, which just, I guess, perpetuates the deadly cycle in the first place.
I guess to steelman the critical race theory, you have the argument that the systems that cause inequality are too powerful in our society, that to pay attention to the psychological is impossible without understanding how thoroughly it is shaped by those systems. And as long as the systems are that powerful, everything else is detail.
Yeah, I think my response would be that the specifics of critical race theory are eerily similar to the factors that are highlighted are eerily similar to the factors that they claim the systems are also accentuating, i.e. race. So, for example, there's a woman, I forgot her name, but there's a woman who wrote this piece that went viral because I think Megyn Kelly took her kid out of her school because of this. This woman wrote a piece basically saying that if you go into a school and it's, an ethnically mixed school, look at the white kids in the school, one of them is going to be a cop killer one day. This is what she wrote in her post. Now, there is no material or psychological difference between that and going into a school and looking at all the black kids and saying, one of these individuals is going to be a gang member, a gangbanger. There's no difference in terms of the caricaturing, the narrowness of that worldview. And so I just think that the tenets are fundamentally wrong. Now, that isn't to say that I think it's unimportant to point out that material equity in the sense of access to housing, access to healthcare, access to sustainable jobs is critically important for the well-being of all human beings, right? But the fact of the matter is, I don't think one can make a sensible argument that material inequity is somehow like the idea that a white person has more material power than a black person, and that idea being what I guess causes racism is fascinating when you think of the fact that there's so many poor white kids, not so many, but many poor white kids who gravitate toward white nationalist groups in the first place because of the economic scarcity, in part at least because of the economic scarcity that they're experiencing. So it doesn't make sense to then suggest that this economically scarce individual has somehow more power. It's actually the less power that's informing their decision in the first place.
I actually think that the interesting case made by an older generation of critical writing, not even just critical race theory, just the critical theories from the 60s and even 50s, is the epistemic argument. That is...
What is that argument?
To oversimplify, it's a post-Marxist argument, but basically saying that our intellectual vocabulary, the way we think about ideas, the way we think about society, and the way we interpret ourselves and our place within society, all of that was created within the status quo in reflection of existing power disparities. So if you buy this argument, it means that the intellectual toolkit that we use to try to get us out of inequality, to think ourselves out of inequality, itself enshrines that very inequality. And that's the basic, interesting philosophical argument that pushes you to look at bigotry is not merely something that occurs within the minds of individuals, but can be, to some extent, inscribed in the language we use to describe the empirical world. But that's the problem. This little nifty, intriguing idea can and is getting grossly overstated. And that's where it gets dangerous, because when you take this idea too literally, and you start using it to interpret real-world policies like housing, labor disputes, or taxes, then you're starting to wade into the shallow and the silly. And this is how you get from a potentially challenging and interesting theory into a place where people are comfortably saying that speech is violence, or lack of speech is violence, or by using the wrong words, you are, quote unquote, literally putting people's lives at risk. That's how you get this insanity. This is where we're starting to lose our minds with an over-academization of things.
Yeah, perhaps that. Yeah, I wonder, actually, as you're saying this out loud, I wonder what the connection is of like the over-academic nature of these issues. I wonder how that relates to the cult of progress. Actually, okay. So I had an aha moment just now, but I just had it, so it might not be fully fleshed out. Probably isn't. So there are several individuals, I would say, that run philosophically the spectrum of the gamut is very large. I'd say everyone from James Baldwin to Jordan Peterson has critiqued the hyper rationalization of society, or has basically like sounded alarms against the obsession with rationality that I think is related to the cult of progress, related to the less beneficial aspects of the Enlightenment. And ironically, I think that there's some thread there with our elevation of the academic so-called knowledge that seems to be leaking into institutions. I don't know that there's... I would have to like...
I think you're hitting on something there, because the way I see it is where the quote-unquote cult of progress can show its bona fides is in engineering, in physics, chemistry, biology, and where you can point to those people, look at those experts, those big E experts, they are doing their job, and every year they're going to do their job better. AI is going to get better, technology is going to get better. And then because they share the same building with people in the humanities, you assume that those people, or with the social sciences, you assume that these other people are also on that same track of constantly accumulating knowledge to clear, better results, quantitatively and qualitatively better results. And that's just not the case with when you're talking about people who are trying to assay the human condition, because now you're dealing with people who subsist on ideology, storytelling, emotional evaluation. It starts getting foggy and murky, and it should be foggy and murky. But when we start regarding them as experts who hold the secrets for human prosperity and the keys to solving the most intractable problems in society, as if they're just engineers making the last changes to their blueprint, then we're treading into problems. And I think that is part of the call to rationalization, because a lot of times when you get into an argument about, and you read a book like, say, Robin DiAngelo's, and I have to assume that people who read it have two immediate reactions if they're honest with themselves. A, this is a corporate manual. This is not literature. And B, like, what is this? This is you're not describing humans here.
Yeah.
These are robotic interactions.
Yeah.
It's cold. It's
mechanical.
It's mechanical.
Yeah.
Right. But then when we try to say it to people, they say, no, but she's an expert. She knows the subject.
Yes.
She has the titles. Academy and the free market have rubber stamped her expertise, and therefore you need to regard her as the authority on race relations. Yeah. And I think that's where it gets problematic. To borrow a phrase from our friends on the other side.
There's a great book that I would recommend about this, because I actually think that I was thinking about this today. I think that the strongest antidote to critical race theory is actually somehow bringing in certain aspects of African American culture that are very much like historically antithetical to this idea of like seeing human beings as reduced to the material. So there's a great book called The Omni-Americans. I forgot the subtitle, but it's by Albert Murray, who's a jazz musician and a literary critic who was friends with Ralph Ellison, who wrote Invisible Man. Both of them had very similar worldviews, but he critiques what he calls the social scientist jive artists who would like come in and social science con artists, yes, who would come in and just like reduce the African American experience to a statistic. And I'm very fascinated by that sort of conversation, because it does speak to the arts, and it does speak to statistics can't be contained in the experience of the transcendent through the arts. It's not something that's like it's not able to be recorded statistically. It requires a different level of instrumentation to measure and to capture. So I don't know. I'd recommend that book if anyone's interested.
Before Vanessa, I can feel the pivot.
Yeah, Vanessa.
No. I actually don't want to. I was going to say I wanted to ask one more thing before we pivot. So
I have another thing after your one more thing.
No, I. This is a little bit of a throwback to what we were talking about.
Also, I hope
earlier.
it's okay with you that I'm drinking wine. It's just
of course, yeah.
I can't resist
I would prefer that to
Shabbat dinner atmosphere.
Yeah, that's a massive glass of wine.
Depending on what happens next, we'll see how far I go.
Yes.
No, I'm just curious. I mean, we've been talking a little bit about, Robin DiAngelo, and it just seems to me, and I also, like, my day job is corporate, and I have these trainings and stuff, and it seems to me like, I don't know, I'm kind of curious to hear if when people are coming to you to hire you in your curriculum and your training, is there almost like a sense of like, is this allowed? Like, are we allowed to go out of the boundaries of what I'm being told is what anti-racism training is supposed to be? I just would love to know a little bit more about what these relationships are like, and how, when you're going through the training, if people feel almost like conflicted because they may be kind of in between two different poles of how you're supposed to relate to this moment in time in terms
especially
of
if they're white.
Probably, but I wouldn't.
But not necessarily. It's actually. I have an anecdotal story where I spoke to an older African American gentleman who told me that one exercise that he was forced to do in critical race theorist training was place something on his like a tag on his shirt that identified him as an oppressed Black man. And this was the wisdom of the folks who came in. So it's not just white folks. It's and I think again this goes to, in general, the flattening of who and what the human being is. That's at the heart of this. But to answer your question, I'd say it depends on like your ranking in the company. So if you are, just an employee then there is sometimes, not always, but sometimes that feeling of caution. Please don't say, please keep the conversation between the two of us. Please don't tell anyone that I'm reaching out. However, when higher ups reach out to me, it's very much different because they have, purchasing power. They have some leverage, obviously, in the company. And also, it's usually most of the higher ups that have come to me after bringing in critical race theory and seeing how it's affected their employees.
Wow.
And saying, like, there has to be a better alternative. I came across your site. Let's talk.
What's a bad result that they come to you about?
Well, just discord and strife between their employees, because some of these practices entail, like, I'm going to separate you into different rooms based on race. I'm going to. I mean, it's crazy. It's segregation, but
it's almost like creating moral segregation isn't a good thing. Isn't conducive for a wholesome environment.
It's very strange, but it fails to heed the lessons. Like, it's very clear to me that the individuals who came up with it were not deeply well versed in the African American tradition, the African American spiritual tradition, which was very much underpinned, the Kingian and even the Malcolm X, quite frankly, strands in the civil rights movement. There's no, like, spiritual, psychological wrestling or insight or interest in the first place into the mind of mankind. So,
and how do you see your role in trying to correct for that?
My role is to say, welcome to the theory of enchantment. I'm going to take you on a magical ride where you will engage in the process of self-discovery, and from self-discovery, self-refinement. And the theory of enchantment is that if you are able to develop an intimate, healthy, loving relationship with yourself, you will be able to, number one, cultivate that same kind of relationship with other human beings, and thus organically want to create a diverse and inclusive space, because you'll be curious about human beings, because you'll have a love for human beings. You will have developed a love for yourself. That's a process. That's like, that doesn't come overnight.
Already hearing this, I can imagine some reactions from people who have absorbed critical race theory, saying that, how dare you tell me to work on myself when society is keeping me out?
Yeah.
How dare you putting it on me?
Yeah. Unfortunately, the only way society can actually change is if it's put upon us, since we make up society.
Do you find that, do you encounter that friction in some of your trainings? Or
I always encounter people asking me that question, but I haven't actually yet. I'm sure it'll happen at some point, but I haven't actually yet encountered anyone who, after going through, let's say, tier 1 of theory of enchantment for business clients, which is an 8-hour workshop, like, there's an opening. But I did a workshop for an architectural firm for the diversity and inclusion team of this architectural firm, and it was like there was an opening, and then afterwards it was so good they requested that it be made mandatory for the entire firm. So
wow.
I mean, it really is enchantment. Like, there's a reason why I use that term in terms of, like, the process by which one really comes to delight in their own life, and there's also less cynicism and far greater optimism when you go through the training.
So what's your kind of vision for a better America?
A better America?
No pressure.
The entire country?
Basically, Chloe, how are you going to fix the American soul?
Listen, I'm only one person.
No, but bring it down to whatever scale you're comfortable with. What's long-term success?
Yeah. What's
your, cult of progress? Your own cult of progress.
That's amazing. I love how you brought it back. Okay, so I have on my whiteboard in front of me here. I wrote on it the Enchantment universe.
Nice.
Listen, I like to say that I want Theory of Enchantment to do what Nike, and I love Nike as a brand, but to do what Nike actually claims to do, because Nike claims to sell human potential, but what Nike actually sells is apparel. And that's fine. That's fine. That's totally fine. I like it. It's aesthetically beautiful.
People need sneakers.
Yeah, and I'm sure that a lot of their sneakers are designed for optimal performance for athletes. So there's like, I'm not trying to downplay it, and I really do. I read a lot about Nike in developing my own company. But what I would actually like to do is master the art of teaching people human potential and teaching people to pursue human potential. And what that means on a practical level is building up the business consultant wing of it, but also I want Theory of Enchantment to have a very strong multimedia sort of empire arm, which is obviously takes a lot of time to create. But because we're so heavily driven by a love of pop culture, we want to make a contribution to the pop culture as well, and to the zeitgeist as well, by eventually being able to produce, podcasts and films and shows that carry the spirit of what we're trying to represent.
I imagine that the dream is it becoming such a dominant force at some point that you can actually be a counterweight to the forces of facile belligerence. The anti-Fox News, anti-Robin DiAngelo.
Well, yeah, to that point, I do want to also be able to prove that compassion is profitable. Because I think that a lot of the multimedia platforms, not just the traditional ones like Fox News and CNN, but also like social media platforms like Twitter and such, are financially incentivized to outrage us, because what are they buying, or what are they selling rather? Consumers' attention. That's what they're selling, and we don't know this, or some of us don't know this, but that's what they're actually selling. They're selling our eyeballs, constantly paying attention to their content. And so what I'm trying to also do with this project is prove that you can make compassionate, healthy content profitable. So yeah, in that sense, it is the anti-Fox News.
Right. That compassion is profitable, and I guess complexity is profitable.
Compassion and complexity, yeah.
I gotta tell you, in my only startup was trying to sell complexity, and
it's because you didn't have the compassion piece.
I did not have the compassion piece, and it did not crash. It succeeded when we stopped being complex and became propaganda, and that's when I had to leave.
Okay.
The market incentives that were just clearly letting us know that if we want to make money, we need to move away from the halcyon days of complexity and paradox and lean into the fucking fan service. Which I wanted to ask you about, because you are an amazing Twitter personality, in my opinion, because you really embody those values of paradox and compassion. And no, I am gonna insist on the nuance. Here's you jump on and like into conversations with people that I would assume you see as your allies to criticize them if they've went too far in one direction, and try to bring them back into a more thoughtful position and being able to see both sides of an argument. Do you find that this is a sustainable model? Because I see a lot of people who start in this position and then kind of get carried away by their growing audience and eventually getting captured by this fan service dynamic. Yeah,
that is a great question. I think this is the classic, power corrupts, and what's the saying? Too much power corrupts.
And Twitter power corrupts, absolutely.
Yes. Yeah. Absolute power corrupts. Absolutely. Yes. So I think it's a question of, is it sustainable? It's, in theory sustainable if I am committed to the exercise of self-refinement. And if I'm committed to holding myself accountable and having other people hold me accountable. But I also have to say that I like living in the nuanced spaces. I started to mute people on Twitter for my sanity recently. And I didn't want to block certain people.
So clearly you're cancel culture.
Yes, exactly. No. So I didn't want to block people who are getting on my nerves. I have a rule basically. If you say something that I find just mean-spirited, I will only block you if you're not actually following me. Because I just assume that you're trolling, that you're like looking for accounts and just like, because how else was I like in your, and that rarely happens. But if you are following me, then you are giving me the time of day. And so, to a certain extent, I am in service of that, and I appreciate that, and I respect that. So I'll just mute you, won't block you. So I don't have to be inundated with it. You can still express your opinion, but you obviously also want exposure to some of my thoughts, and so we can have that mutual exchange without any of us losing our minds. And so I think that the mute function is a beautiful function to self-regulate. But yeah, I mean, if I ever become a parody of myself or insufferable, I trust that folks like you will tell me. So
I've seen you trying to tell that to people in so many words in some engagements, and it did not necessarily work well. Does that is that without necessarily? I mean, you can name names if you want, but without necessarily bring up specific examples. Do you find that happening often? Do you find that frustrating?
Well, I think I've gotten, and I think it's a never-ending process. I think I've gotten better at communicating with people. There was a point after the election, actually, when Biden won, I no longer felt that I needed to
quote unquote won.
Stop. I no longer felt that I needed to. No, this is actually specific. Interestingly enough, this is not specific to Trump supporters. This is specific to the wing of the Democratic Party that's like more pro critical race theory. When Biden won, I saw that as a signal that I no longer needed to act as if those people had long-term relevance, because I saw Biden's winning as an indication that they do not. Because what immediately erupted, and you saw this on CNN, was a very interesting conversation within the upper echelons of the Democratic Party about the problems with this academic jargon that was being put out by folks that really costs some Democrats their elections. And then you had former President Barack Obama coming out saying certain things.
That abolish the police is, what was
that?
Snippy
Stupid.
Slogans? Yes, stupid. that was Obama for stupid.
Snappy slogans.
Yep.
So where was I going with this? I had a point.
You're getting used to people disappointing you?
So for some reason, my entire understanding of Twitter transformed after that. I no longer saw Twitter, at least in part, as this like antagonistic tool with which to go after folks you disagree with. I realized that to a certain extent, I don't think I did this a lot, but I was still captivated by this phenomenon, even as I was warning against it. I think I paid too much attention to folks who seemingly had a very large audience, or on Twitter they did, but in terms of impact in the outside world, actually don't have much impact at all. And so I'm learning the art of understanding the distinction between signal and noise.
Recognizing some people as just Potemkin accounts, essentially.
Yeah,
also, and there's nothing behind it.
And also that going after them not only doesn't help, it hurts, because I think to a certain extent what you pay attention to expands. And like I know for a fact that so many things that folks in the quote unquote woke left, so much of the terminology used is not mainstream. It appears to be mainstream because of the weird nature of Twitter and the weird way it works. It's not mainstream. And so instead of acting as if it is, I am going to ignore it.
I mean, that you're hitting this is it, right? Because that's the feedback loop that makes Twitter feel so devoid from reality and real human concerns, because you get, it's not just Twitter, it's the online conversation, and
but it's also interesting, Adam,
so sorry, I just want to finish this thought before I lose it, because I'm seeing it running away from me. It's
the line.
Oh no, I'm so much less on point when I'm sober. The ideas of that are so not, that you describe as not mainstream, of the ideas of the woke left, get so much attention because the people carrying them online seem to be important, but then also the reaction to them is disproportionate.
Right.
It becomes mainstream on the anti-left media sewer to obsess about the weirdest weirdos of the woke left. And now we're all just being flushed down the drain of this fecal water that we were told is supposed to be a public discourse. When Trump, or for that matter, Rush Limbaugh, talk about cancel culture and political correctness, they don't really care about free expression. They just show that they can punch back at these Potemkin liberal Twitter accounts. But then the rest of the world basically gets crunched into the same stupid conversations. I'm often seeing inane American Twitter culture war nonsense being relitigated in the Israeli press. Why? These are fake conversations.
It's a fake conversation.
It's a fake conversation, but it actually has occasionally real world consequences. In Hungary 2 years ago, I think, or a year ago, Viktor Orban, by decree, shut down university departments because they had whiffs of critical race theory. Cynical people around the world are able to use this vapid culture war to cause real life damage, and it's freaking terrifying. And it works because people are so caught up in these fake conversations that they're letting this happen, as long as the power grab is in service of whatever stupid side you're on in the stupid culture war. I'm done ranting. Sorry, Vanessa.
No, but I mean, what I was saying earlier is that, so Chloe, we had a friend of ours on the podcast for an episode where every now and then we do like a shoot the shit episode with friends who we hope bring in interesting perspectives. And we brought in our friend Misha, who is an ex-evangelical Black liberal who we found out in the course of the conversation.
James Baldwin is his political awakening, we should mention. He was gay, married, believes in radical compassion, is a profound liberal. He's not. And we found out in the course of our conversation that he had voted for Trump. And we spent the conversation like unpacking that and why. And a huge part of it, I think, and I don't know if we would necessarily call it Twitter per se, because I don't think Misha's like on Twitter, but it was like the Twitter like fake conversations that so whipped him into a frenzy about like he kind of came to the conclusion that it would be better for America if Trump was reelected, because otherwise we'll get stuck in this kind of endless I don't know, I find it hard to understand where he was coming from, but we'll get more wine.
I need more wine. It's going to be bad because we're not going to like course correct in the way that we are, that we need to rather. But what was interesting to me when you were telling me about how your relationship with Twitter changed after Biden won, it sounds like, in fact, Biden being elected is actually better in terms of the quality of conversation and the way that we can grapple with some of the extremes of the left. And I was just wondering if you would like, if that makes sense to you, if you feel like the fact that Biden won as opposed to Trump is potentially putting us in the right direction.
Yes. And I have heard some folks say what your friend said. I put out a question on Twitter before the election, inviting Trump supporters to tell me their reasons for voting for him. And I said, this is a non-judgment zone. I just want to know what is your motivation? And like hundreds of people responded. It was actually very fascinating. And some people responded in that way. But in my view, yes, because Trump is essentially an extension or a foil or a mirror image to me of critical race theory. Like he adheres to certain fundamental tenets, or he uses certain fundamental, like his view of power is like very zero sum, just like it's viewed in critical race theory. He believes in or he has, dehumanized in many ways, certainly rhetorically on Twitter, his political enemies in the same way that critical race theorists do, ostracizing them and calling them losers, what have you. So I actually see Donald Trump as a continuation of or an embodiment really of some of the basic principles or ideas within critical race theory, not necessarily with the racialist lens, but just with the power dynamics piece. I think he operates on a similar level, whereas I don't think that's true for Joe Biden.
And there's also, I like the argument that in a way this was the best result for taming the excess on the left, because you got the first of all, a moderate won the country. We're seeing that as a political strategy, it's more effective. And down the ballot, Democrats have lost.
Right, it's like
which I think
some balance
right,
on some level.
Exactly, which is in a simplistic way, it gives you an indication that maybe there is kind of a call for moderation. I think it's an oversimplified explanation, but but there is a case there. It's interesting. The Misha debate that we had, it takes us to another topic I wanted to ask you about. After the conversation, it became a bit of a game with some of our listeners and a few of our friends to try to figure out, why did Misha actually do it? We weren't even expecting it when we started the conversation. We just invited him over to talk, and he suddenly sprung it on us. Hey guys, I just came back from the ballot. I voted for Trump. And we were like, that's intriguing. It went on for 2 hours in the talk itself.
I immediately pulled up my bottle of wine and got ready for that one.
No, exactly. It was, you could hear my excitement when he said it. It was like, it's joyous. One of my many theories was it was a Raskolnikov situation. He's like, he doesn't really know why he did it. He's captured. He's captured.
He's possessed ideologically. Yes.
But a friend has suggested that it's actually his tendency for radical empathy. Part of his identity is to be able to put himself in other people's shoes, and understand where they're coming from, feel for them, almost suffer their pain.
That's intense.
And in this case, and being in New York, living in Harlem, for him, the other is the Trump supporter. I wanted to ask you about this idea of radical empathy, because it seems to me that some of your work calls for radical empathy as a path forward.
Yeah, I don't know that I would advocate for the manifestation of radical empathy in that particular way, just because it suggests, it seems to suggest this kind of depersonalization or association with the self. And I don't think that that's healthy. I think empathy has to be grounded in empathy for the self. But we do teach empathy. The process of developing empathy is rooted in that process of developing empathy for yourself, which comes from understanding yourself, understanding how these different things that are sort of always operating within your universe, how they affect you, how you can witness these things affecting you. So, for example, we teach this concept called breaking the fourth wall, which in theater is, when an actress starts speaking to the audience as opposed to the rest of the actresses. So Fleabag is a famous show that makes use of this, so is The Office. But within the context of theory of enchantment, breaking the fourth wall is when you become aware of the fact that the emotional baggage that informs your behavior might also be informing the behavior of others that you encounter. So, for example, if I know that I act defensively when I am feeling insecure, if I come across an insecure person, a defensive person, like arbitrarily, randomly, it's like I don't understand why they're acting defensive. I didn't do anything to them. I haven't, said anything to them. Why are they acting in a defensive way? I can pause and say to myself, oh, is this person acting defensively because they're feeling insecure for whatever reason? And then I can also make a conscious decision to be aware of that, to be cognizant of that, and to do everything in my power. And to a certain extent, some of this is outside of your control, but everything in my power to not contribute to that insecurity. Because if you contribute to the insecurity, then you make the problem and the possibility of negative conflict, unnecessary conflict, worse. And this is something I think that is more easily palatable when we're talking about bringing this kind of training to young people. Like, people get it, like, especially educators, guidance counselors, they understand that, like, teenagers are developing hormonally and their brains are firing off on all cylinders. And of course we need these tools. But I think as adults, we forget that this is actually a lifelong process. So yeah, we definitely use different pop culture references to teach some of these aspects. For example, we use hip hop, specifically the work of Kendrick Lamar, to teach a lot of these. There's a brief clip of Kendrick Lamar talking about empathy in Compton, where he's from, and we use that to teach some of these principles. There's a conversation with Jay-Z where he's speaking about some of the revelations that he had in therapy about, like, the inner self and how it affects the outer world. But again, it's all rooted in relationship with the self. It still, it doesn't, I think there's not this belief that, like, because I have empathy for you, then you can't be held accountable for your actions, right? But I can still put myself in your shoes and see how you would come to a conclusion without making that conclusion myself, right? So
I just want to say that I've definitely oversimplified Misha's view as well. Just to give credit, he's a beloved friend, and we spent 2 hours unpacking this.
Sure enough.
This is definitely an oversimplified and probably wrong explanation of his reasosoning.
But it sounds like Chloe's kind of describing the difference between cognitive empathy and emotional empathy,
Yeah,
which
I
we
guess
just
so.
talked about with Paul Bloom. He was on the show, our previous episode, and he was saying that cognitive empathy, when you understand where people are coming from, very useful.
Mhm.
Emotional empathy, when you feel what other people are feeling, potentially destructive. But it is interesting to think about, like, his point is that you need to strive for a more, like, rational compassion. Is it rational compassion, Adam? What's
think
the term
so.
he uses?
Mm.
Rational compassion as opposed to empathy. He's like, but it makes me wonder what you were saying earlier in terms of us our society being kind of hyper rational at the moment. I'm curious to know if you would agree that what ails our current society is an over emotionality or a lack of ability to reason abstractly and come to rational conclusions, as opposed to thinking and responding too emotionally and too kind of immediately in ways that might be ultimately unhelpful for our society as a whole.
Yeah, I think it might be both. I think we might suffer from too much rationality and also too much emotion. We just need to have a sort of recalibration of these two things. So in certain contexts, there's too much rationality where we reduce human beings to statistics, similar to what we discussed earlier. And we mistakenly believe in our sort of like central planning policies that the only thing that matters is the material welfare of communities. Timothy Carney wrote a great book called Alienated America, where he showed how the causal factor in the 2016 primary in those communities that voted for Trump was alienation. And you could, he pointed out how you could trace where communities, you could predict which communities would vote for Trump over Mitt Romney by seeing which ones were marked by pockets of opioid addiction, alcoholism, deaths of despair. And he also pointed out that this actually wasn't a financial situation, because there was a county in Pennsylvania, I think it was, where he showed how for a certain period of time there were jobs in the area where young men would actually drive in from all over the country, because or all over the region rather, because these were some of the only jobs in the area. I think it was fracking jobs, and they paid really well, actually. So these men weren't materially impoverished, but they weren't able to get married, establish communities, go to have civic institutional life, and that was what correlated with voting for Trump. So it wasn't just the material wealth; it was also again, spiritual, psychological wealth. So in that piece, where you would just look at it from the outside in and assume, oh, well, they have money, so what's the problem? That's you being too rational, right? In a sense, right? You don't understand the emotional piece that's also necessary for the health of the society. And then when you're sort of like, I think, ideologically possessed, when you're like, when all that surrounds you is the emotion, like when you can't make sense of the emotion, and so it sort of engulfs you. I think that's when that's too much. That's a case of too much emotion.
You said it perfectly, though, recalibrating, because it's not just a matter of too much one or the other. You could have too much of both. Like, you can definitely see the people who will have heightened emphasis on identity, which is an emotional side of it, and the sense of persecution, but also then try to solve it by hyper-rationalization.
Which is so ironic, because if you look at some of the slides that other anti-racism firms bring into the workplace, they all use the same slide. I've seen this in so many different firms. And there's a slide that it's divided into two. One side says, and I kid you not, examples of white supremacy. And the other side says something like examples of the opposite or whatever. And they list things like either or forms of thinking. Now, this is something that human beings have been doing since, we have come to be. This has nothing to do with white supremacy. This is a human thing, right? They list, so that's one thing that, like, every time I see this slide, I'm like, what? How is this?
That's what it literally says.
It literally says that one of the functions of white supremacist culture is to engage in an either or form of thinking. That's literally what it says. And I'm like, but human beings and all cultures and all races since before America was even thought of have been engaging in either or forms of thinking. So it's like very bizarre, because, and then on the other side, they will list positive things to pursue, like interdependence or collaboration in the workplace, which is all good. But another thing that they do is they list,
and the thing itself is an either or.
Right, the thing itself is an either or. It's so incoherent. But the other thing that they list as negative is like hyper rationalization.
Right.
And it's like, but you're engaging in hyper rationalization. Right. What's the level?
You're literally list making, charting, and classifying.
It's like very confused.
But right, the whole method of taxonomy, that's white supremacy if I ever saw it. It's the most European 18th century thing, putting things in orders and classes and separate divisions.
Yes, exactly. And that's why I don't agree with, some of my conservative brothers and sisters who, and I don't want to downplay their concerns, because there are some bad things happening in the public school system in terms of the way critical race theory is affecting the cognitive development and just the basic health of young people. It's just not healthy. However, it's so incoherent and so muddied that I don't suspect it'll be long lasting.
You think it's self-devouring in a way?
Not only is it self-devouring, ironically, there is legislation in our institutions that comes from Civil Rights Act of 1964 that presupposes that some of what's being done is actually a violation. And you couldn't write this, you couldn't make this up, but not only is it destructive, it's arguably, could be pursued in a court of law. Yeah, like you can get sued for it.
It is the legal. I don't want to drag us there, but I'm a legophile, and I just get excited every time we get into the ways that ideologies contradict themselves through policy. And this just made me think about the Princeton case, which I'm sure you paid full attention to.
Oh yes, that I have to say that was awesome. That was amazing. That was like such a chess move. I had to give credit where credit was due for that one.
I don't know what it was. What was
right, can you recap it for Vanessa?
So basically, Princeton came out in the spirit of critical race theory and said, I forgot who, I think it was the dean maybe, or whatever.
I think so.
But it said, we are a racist institution. We are admitting that we have so much work to do. This sort of very, confessatorial or confessional language. And so the Trump administration basically responded by saying, "Oh, you're a racist institution? We should probably review that, and we should probably review if public tax money should be going to you and we should probably review if you're in violation."
Right, you've just self-testified that you're committing racism, and we do have anti-racist laws from the Civil Rights Act.
We actually have existing. So
like, who are we to argue with your?
Right.
Wow.
I'm not a fan of the Trump administration, but that was a good moment.
That was definitely high on the list. Yeah.
Chloe, I know that we're running short on time, but can I ask you a couple more questions, or one more?
Sure.
We'll see. I don't know if you have a heart out, but so when you were talking about this idea of there being kind of like a natural end to kind of critical race theory, from what I've read of what you think about cancel culture, you similarly think that it's going to have it's going to come to its own natural end as well. But the reason that I think you posited is that because if cancel culture were to continue, it would mean the end of art as we know it. And I was wondering if you wouldn't mind speaking to that. Why you think art and cancel culture have a relationship there?
Yeah, and I think it's the same reason why I think critical race theory will also end, is because of the artistic piece. And quite frankly, it's simply because art gives expression to the complexity of the human being. And so if you are, I think, an artist, if you're a true artist, then, and I think we've seen this reflected in the work of folks like Dave Chappelle, for example.
I was going to say,
if you're a true artist, then you are, to a certain extent, the gatekeepers, I think, of our culture, of our society. And at the very least, there will be a clash between trends like cancel culture and critical race theory and the artist. And it's simply because, cancel culture and the cancel culture specifically rejects the redemptive nature of our species, our ability to change and to transform and to reform. And I think cancel culture is antithetical to restorative justice, which is slowly but surely becoming popular. And we teach restorative justice in the theory of enchantment. So
we're going to have an interview about restorative justice soon.
Oh, nice. Yeah. Very cool. Yeah. So I just think also because there's such a vibrant artistic tradition within African-American culture, I think that there will be a clash. I mean, there already is a clash, but it will become more readily apparent that, and you'll notice this is more cultural than racial. There will be a clash between those sort of acolytes of critical race theory / cancel culture. And I think the two streams sort of meet at a certain point. And those who want to uphold or believe in the beauty of historically the African-American tradition, which the artistic aspects of the Harlem Renaissance, for example, gave expression to the complexity of the human being. James Baldwin talked about the complexity of the human being. I have a piece coming out hopefully soon about how you can follow Ibram Kendi or you can follow James Baldwin. You cannot follow both. It's they're two fundamentally different things.
The little irony there is that, in a way, you're again proposing your own version, your own cult of progress, assuming.
say more.
Your assumption there is that, and I emotionally share it, that at some point basically the human spirit will rebel against it. Yeah. There is only so much Robin DiAngelo that you can read before you feel that your life has become an empty shell.
Yes.
And that's and then when you hear, that's why when you hear Dave Chappelle, you laugh,
right. Yes.
Because it
yes, I'm making a big leap and saying you're going to keep laughing.
Exactly. I've grown more pessimistic. My newfound skepticism of progress has gone so far that I'm even doubting whether the human spirit cannot be numbed to an extent that
see, this is where I bring in history to bear to make my argument. If it is possible that, we know the human spirit has proved resilient in times past. There's no reason why it should prove otherwise in our contemporary, stage. And I don't think this is about progress. Again, I just think progress as such. I don't think it's like some point in time where, there's like after history, right? What was the name of the book?
Fukuyama, the end of history.
Yes, exactly.
You're suggesting that the human spirit constantly moves towards some form of liberation.
The human spirit is constantly recalibrating, to put it in.
When I listened to you talk, it made me think of Yeshayahu Leibovich. Do you know him? He's an Israeli.
Yes, why do I know him?
Probably
What
from
did he
your
write?
Israel connection. He wrote a lot about the physical mental problem. He's a Israeli philosopher and political commentator. He dead for decades, but still a big name. My version of a Che Guevara shirt is of his silhouette. He himself embodies the type of contradictions and paradox that we were talking about as a writer and a thinker. He's an Orthodox Jew who's also one of Israel's most dominant speakers in favor of separation of synagogue and state. And even in his 80s, he was one of Israel's most radical leftists. He was asked once in one of my favorite exchanges, do you believe in the Messiah? Leibovich says, of course, the Messiah will come.
Yeah.
The interviewer says, great. Do you know how will the Messiah arrive? When will the Messiah arrive? Leibovich leers at him and then says vexedly, the Messiah will arrive. A Messiah that has arrived is a false Messiah.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah. So he's always coming. He's always coming.
The Messiah,
on the way.
It is categorically a Messiah will come.
The Messiah actually never arrives.
Exactly. I thought that was it. I think this is in a way what
it's
you're
actually
saying.
Very Jungian. Jung had very similar interpretations of Christianity. That he believed that the Christ was essentially an archetype that you were supposed to embody, not worship in a sort of there's a parallel between those two.
I think it goes to not to use a trite phrase. I think we've exhausted this phrase already in our conversation right now, but the human condition, it is
it's so not a trite phrase.
It is a beautiful but trite phrase. And we just reach out to that again, to go Jungian to the numinous, but we're never going to reach it, and it's
right. And you're not supposed to reach it.
You're not supposed to reach it, and to oversimplify again, the problem with the fake conversation that happens between right and left right now, I think, in trying to seek our cultural salvation, if the left goes too far into believing that we are going to reach there and we're reaching there and we just need to tweak a few more things, that's the cult of progress, right? We're going to change a few more things in our society and then we're going to reach into the ultimate paradise. And the right maybe has gone overly to the side of like, we don't even need to hope for that. We don't even need. We're kind of good. We're better 50 years ago. So let's hold still, and that's how we're stuck. So if there is hope, it's in us somehow embracing that Leibovichian contradiction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I do want to ask you about Israel though, before letting you go.
Okay.
Because I like ending on light topics.
Sure. Another country. Yes. A whole country. Yes.
A whole country. The segue that we were thinking about was from just went all over the map already, so it's not quite as smooth as planned. But we were talking about the critical race theory and the conversation of racism in the United States, and listening to you. You should also, for our listeners, tell a little bit about how you got into. I mean, you've already implied your Jewish connection, like you're not non-Jewish connection, exogenous Jewish connection. But also, you've done some. You've been involved from a young age in. You're still young. In your younger age, you're involved in Israel-related activism. So we should say a little bit about that. But also, wonder what you think about the way that the Israeli conversation gets filtered through the American prism. It's a very old gripe of mine to see how anything in international politics, when discussed in the United States, is seen through the very narrow lens of shallow understanding of civil rights movement without really trying to grasp the differences and the variety of international politics. And it specifically applies to Israel, where the dichotomy of oppressor seems to be suggesting itself too easily.
I mean, that's a whole 2-hour conversation in and of itself. To try to sort of condense, Theory of Enchantment was the organic product of my nearly 10 years of doing Israel advocacy. So I did it on college campuses and also a little bit post college. And I kept running into this problem of shouting matches on campuses. When
Shouting matches about Israel?
Funny. Yeah, I mean, anytime the Israeli-Palestinian conflict would come up, there would be this, not all the time, but often enough. And I kept thinking, what if there could be like these first principles that people agreed to practice when discussing controversial, challenging topics, that they would hold themselves accountable to? And those principles ended up being the 3 principles of theory of enchantment. And I went from being sort of a dogmatic Hasbara-nick person and to being like, I went from reading polemics to reading literature, and Amos Oz became one of my favorite authors. And I think the engagement.
What's your favorite book?
Definitely, Tell of Love and Darkness.
Yeah,
is pretty freaking awesome. And it's basically his autobiography. So
yeah, it's amazing.
I refuse to watch the movie because I just assume it sucks.
Oh, me too.
I just assume. But my exposure to the literary treatment of the conflict was very much a catalyst for wanting to create a framework that taught people how to love, because there's so much love that shines through his assessments and and his bearing witness to everything that's happening around him, to the Jew and the Arab. And I wanted to create a kind of system that could produce that, or produce the desire within people to want that. So it first started out as a question of how do you actually love within the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? And then I started lecturing on it, and people were like, this is universally applicable to so many things. And then so it became its own thing. So it's interesting. The theory of enchantment piece is very much rooted in the Israel piece, very much an outgrowth of my love of an engagement with Israel. In terms of the international arena, I mean, I have to say I've gotten a bit jaded by Hasbara, just because I think Hasbara falls into the same
propaganda.
Well, yes, but to be more precise, it's the same signal versus noise problem. Absolutely. That I think
it's a noise amplifier.
Yeah, it's a noise amplifier, which isn't helpful ultimately. And so I think that while there's a whole bunch of different dynamics here. There's the noise amplification that is Hasbara, which is unhelpful. There's the question of the way identity and how it's in flux, and how identity is viewed in America or experienced in America through an American lens, which is very different from identity being experienced through the Israeli or even the Palestinian lens. And when one is superimposed upon the other, it just doesn't work. And this reflects an incapacity of individuals, nations, elites, etc., to hold space for, this goes back to what we talked about in the beginning, to hold space for different modes of being and different modes of living within one's own identity. And to be able to switch from one to the other, or to just understand both as different ways of understanding the world, is not really countenanced in the oppressor versus oppressed framework, which is, again, a flattening framework. So, I mean, that's very much only touching the surface, but that's what I would say about that entire question.
Yeah, I'm just like, the urge is to keep you here for 3 more hours. But, well,
I appreciate that. Maybe we'll have a conversation again.
I was going to say,
another conversation.
Before you go, I heard you started playing guitar. Do you mind playing something?
On guitar, I mean, I could send you a track to play after, like as an outro.
Yes, why not? Let's do that.
Yeah, because my guitars aren't tuned right now, and that would be not good for your listeners' ears. But I could definitely send you a track that you can play in the outro if you'd like.
I would like that. That would be fun.
Awesome, and I love, because it's you can cut this out, but I have this theory that theory of enchantment is also very much informed by my whole DJ thing, and it's my theory is that is what I call the great convergence, which is what happens on the dance floor with when a DJ is like knows what they're doing, right? You have this experience of the numinous and oneness of human beings on the dance floor. And so my whole theory about convergence is by bringing in pop culture, bringing in music, bringing in the arts, bringing in these different things that so many different people from different walks of life gravitate toward and relate to, I can cause a massive convergence.
Nice. Massive Convergence, the name of your next album.
I also approached Twitter with that mindset as a DJ. The one time I actually went viral, I was trending on Twitter this year for the first time in my life, which was nuts. But it affirmed my DJ theory because I was trending because I wrote this thread about how those who subscribe to critical race theory and a lot of Trump supporters suffer from the same thing, which is alienation. And I wrote this entire thread, like pulling from different sources, showing, and it literally went viral. Which proves that, like, and it was going viral because Trump supporters were sharing it and people on the left were sharing it. That's the great convergence. And that's beautiful when that
Massive
happens.
Convergence.
Yes.
Nice.
It's awesome.
Well, thank you, Chloe.
Chloe, this was
Thank
a pleasure.
you both.
Thank you.
This was awesome.
Before we let you go, we'd love to tell you about new friends we've made.
Yeah, we have discovered a new podcast called What Does It Profit? It's a show all about the kind of tricky ethical considerations that come up when you're a corporation trying to do good in this world. And, what does it take? What are the challenges? How do you overcome them? And it's hosted by Dawn Carpenter.
Yep, she's a scholar who's done her PhD dissertation on the intersection between the business world, ethics, and morality. She brings great guests with really interesting perspectives on this topic, but also her own insight into it is unique, which is why we're going to have Dawn as a guest very soon.
We're going to talk not just about the idea about corporations and whether or not they can actually be actors for social good, but also talk about some other interesting stuff that she's covered in her research, things like contributive justice theory.
She's done some work on moral foundations, which we've referenced last time, which hopefully we'll get to talk about. And also she promised me a Noam Chomsky anecdote. So there's that. Check her out at What Does It Profit podcast. Thank you for listening to Uncertain Things. What you're hearing in the background is Chloe Valdary's track, Poe. Please follow us on uncertain.substack.com and wherever you get your podcasts. Make sure to give us a 5-star rating on Apple if you're feeling kind. Say hi to us on Twitter and Instagram at UncertainPod. And do tell your friends. Till next time, stay sane.